of what I think is a way out. You're very right, I didn't mention what the nature of the public is. But what I have done, for example, in the response to Ramila and others, is to make a very simple point that the public is not given. We do not inhabit a public. We constantly create a public. And I decided to add the public here after our discussions yesterday with Shima on this question of education and thing. What are we doing in our universities today? And I think that's an extremely important project which cannot be done in isolation from each other. So one aspect, there are two examples of public which I wanted to use. One portion of the public is of course all kinds of public domains, public spaces, which are very correctly exclusive in various ways. I also use the example of a thing which Gopal and me did, which I talked about earlier on in this Kannada newspaper Prajavani, where we did a 6-month public debate on caste experiences and a compilation of it and so on. And when we did it, as part of that is to say, how does a transmigration happen from a so-called accepted public space accessible to me, let's say as an academic, or to Romila, Sundar, to a much larger space where a public is created through the voice of it. So the experiment we did with a newspaper, which every month, those who know, every Monday in one of the biggest newspapers in Karnataka, called Prajavani, it's a decade-long publication. Every Monday there's a full page, center page on a public discussion on caste. So we publish thousands, hundreds of letters, it's all archived. Now, all those things are available. Now, what we did in that notion of the public is to move away, other than the printed paper public, also the so-called network, digital public. And we said, well, that is also accessible in Kannada to people who want to do it, etc. So, I mean, these are experiments which are very partial. I don't think they are successful in any sense. Which I it's very obvious to me. So, how does this notion of a public itself be created? How do we now create a debate on the idea of the public? It's not about occupying the public. And I see this as a larger point. That is, how do we, as 50 people who are thinking alike about this, how do we create a public space where we'll talk about minority without the exclusions of certain kinds of debate, which a political space might not allow, which different political parties might not allow? How do we do that? And to me, the university is a very important place to do that. And that's why, with all the problems of university, there is still a kind of an ideal of a university which historically we may try to recapture in parts at least, which is beyond some notion of immediacies which mark various political things and so on. I don't know, and maybe that itself is a problem, but I'm still thinking aloud on that point about what is it the public is thing. I think reducing the public to majority, yes, in the way, if you look at public in the way we are talking about, spaces which are proscribed by the public is called the public, but I'm not talking about them using the word public in a larger sense. I think that also answers back to Sibyl's point also about the question of how do we even engage in this notions of the public vis-a-vis this majority. And I think you probably understood this point I was trying to do in the context of sociality, trying to see what is it that differentiates the sociality of majority and minority as a very central question. Because I think unless we don't understand that, then many of the issues surrounding the majority minority become problematic. We don't know how to deal with those concepts when we encounter them. I think I would subscribe to all this is that these are politically difficult categories, for ethically different categories and so on. The exercise I was trying to do here is just to say, well, if I want to think through it in a particular way in order to make certain kinds of interventions in society, how am I do it? And so, as I said, I chose this particular path to try and reflect on it, partly in order to get some lot of clarity for myself too. I think it's also a little base question about identities and these people who don't fit into categories and identities, and also the more troubling question which you said about minorities who want to be minorities. And again, my point here is when we invoke those term minority here, repeatedly, this is the point I'm coming back to, that the semantic space occupies different domains and they don't mean the same thing at all. So what I would want to push at to understand is those minorities who want to call them minorities, or these nomads and poets who want to call them, classified minorities, in what sense of the meaning of the word minorities do we include them along with, let's say, religious minorities, social minorities, sexual minorities, and so on. So, in other words, what I'm trying to find out is all these are grouped under one category called minorities, let's say the sexual, the cultural, the social, and these other minorities you're talking about, unnamed minorities. But what is the idea of a minority you are using so that all of them are seen as minority? That's all. So the very way you phrased it implies that these are not the counted minorities. So very good. So we throw out the counting as a characteristic. Then what about domination? Because that's the other very important part of minorities. That's the public space argument. They are dominated. They are in the I think what was spoken was talking about core at the periphery. They are marginalized on the periphery, etc. That's another notion of minority which is being used. So when you say that there are all these types of minorities, what is the meaning of minority which binds them all as minorities? I still think that remains a very important theoretical question, and we may have, of course, different tools to engage with that. And okay, this is a very difficult question you pose about the power relation between majority and minority, right? So if I understood right, I mean here we have a very difficult situation of a minority which actually functions like a majority, and that's the point about the conception of Hinduism I was talking about, which so many people have been writing about recently. That is, how is it that a small group of Brahminical upper caste, I mean now I'm invoking upper caste because that spread of Brahminism has gone on to occupy the upper caste, and that's very important to see them as a joint force. Now you have this so-called small minority under whose sign a whole Hinduism is being brought together. I mean RSS is one example of that, right? But it's happening, as you know, across very many different practices. It's happening, for example, in the practices of legitimation of Brahmin priests and non-Brahmin marriages in Tamil Nadu, which is I think a very troubling shift which has happened in recent times, which some of us have commented on and been looking at, which is earlier. I mean, even Karunanidhi's wife and daughter, by the way, came to the Udupi temple. And Karunanidhi recently said something very interesting about wearing saffron and Ramanujan. He's writing a TV serial on Ramanujan. But the point is that the legitimization of the Brahminical class as priests, which will officiate on newer and newer rituals of non-Brahmin households, including not just for marriages, all kinds of other naming ceremonies, etc., is happening. So there is a very different kind of a dynamics which is happening there. I mean, in traditional sociological accounts of the rule of the Brahmin, the most traditional account would be the rule of the priests, right? The earliest model of the priests ruling a community through the mediating between the king and the subjects of the king, I mean subjects and God and so on. But whatever those kinds of accounts are there of a minority ruling a majority, it to me, in the context of this beef ban in Maharashtra, which is one of the most shocking things if you see nationally, Maharashtra and is one of the most progressive states that I have known. And if I looked at all the activists over the last few years, whether it was whether it's Baba Amte, or you look at the whole Meda Patkareni, but I mean, you look at the whole long range of activists from very ancient times, of course, they're all Maharashtrians. I mean, in the sense there is a very deep sense of social consciousness within the community, and there's a great sense of groundedness in my own engagement with Maharashtra. Even scholars and academics, I mean, they're so different from the Delhi elite and so on. And for this to happen in a place like Maharashtra, which has one of the strongest Dalit movements, and very strongly, at least in the so-called quote-unquote public thing on the Muslim presence, for it to happen there in the way it's happened is shocking. I think there it goes way beyond the questions of minority majority. I mean, I think you need very different apparatus to unpack this. Because the two great examples of minorities ruling majorities within the Brahmins or the Indian social system and the British, which rule India politically. And I think the colonial discourse is another very good example to understand this. How is it that the British themselves, when they write about it, are very surprised? How is it that the few of us as sitting as merchants who are sitting in Calcutta or somewhere were able to rule this country. I mean, I think nobody is more surprised than the British at the ease at which one handful of people can actually rule a country like India. And you know, part of it, and it's always interested me as, the historians probably can answer this far better, but to me, it's always interested me is to look at the nature of power. That, you know, these guys, I saw when I was in Lucknow, I went and saw that palace, and it was this big palace there, and how the British negotiated the taking over of that Awadh, I think it was in Awadh Empire, and then the Lucknow palace. And it's very interesting. I mean, it looks like Amar Siddhartha, you place one person against another person and so on. But the ease in which they actually get people to sign off things to them, you know. So how do I make sense of it? Is it really about majority, minority, or is it about something else which is happening there? And I thought the only way I have made sense of it, I mean, I still don't understand it, but as I said, historians probably have a better idea. The way I make sense of it is what something which Ananthamurthy had once said, and then which I have repeatedly discovered in rural Karnataka. It is that Ananthamurthy, I think, records somewhere that his grandmother, when they were talking with the fact that the British Empire was there, his grandmother was living in a village, never even knew the British ruled India. And he was saying basically that there are people who continued their existence, and to them, whether it was somebody else ruling in Delhi or it was the British ruling, it didn't matter to them at all. And even today, if somebody goes and says, somebody else is ruling in Delhi, do you know, we should all be very worried, they are like, they don't get it. Because in their consciousness, they have nothing to do with Delhi. They don't have that's why this question of, you know, this majority, minority consciousness is very difficult, because they don't have any notion of Indian in the sense we would think that they had a consciousness of Indian. So to them, if they would resist the British as Indians, or they would resist the Brahmins as, I'm just drawing the parallel, would mean a consciousness of them being connected to it. And to them, they were not connected to it. Absolutely, they were dissociated with it. The British were there, very good. What did they do? They ruled you, and they have no clue what the ruling means. And when it comes, I'm just giving a very, in this sense, a pop sociology account of the Brahminical thing too, but I'm sure you can see that there's been interesting work on this, is that it is in the same way that the notion of ruling of an elite is not reduced to the way we understand ruling today as. Not as a set of prescribed rules, or there will be prescribed rules of social behavior, right? Don't do this, you know, girls can't go to school. I'm just giving examples of that kind. But in terms of political normative action as citizens and rulers, they just don't see the agents in action. Ananthamurthy's grandmother didn't see the British acting as political rulers. And in the case of the Brahmins, the subjugated don't see the Brahmins acting as political rulers. They may be doing other things. And through it, you do the manipulations of ruling of people. So, at least to me, I think in that sense, it raises a very fundamental question of, you know, how this majority itself is being constructed in terms of this thing. Especially, as I said, given the fissure in this thing, and Garvapasi is a very problematical thing, because it is re-emphasizing this homogeneity and anonymity, which is very important for a majority to happen. And that's why I was trying to pull out those characteristics in order to understand what is the dynamics of majority and minority. In that sense, the process of becoming majority or minority. What are the points which go into it, into creating that? And I think, I know I've not probably answered any of the questions, but at least it gives me a space to think through some of what you have said, and also for me to understand really how do we, this is my far more larger important thing, how do we as people interested in similar topics, how do we come together and create this notion of some sense of the public where for things we disagree upon with the ruling class, disagree with other communities around us, how do we even come together to do it? And when university systems have come under great challenge, and education system under such challenge as it is now, how do we even find that space to talk to each other about it? So I want to thank all of you, and thank Dr. Shiva, and also the name of Shamir and his family for this wonderful opportunity to share these few ideas. Thank you so much.
I invite Dr. Sankaracharya to propose the vote of thanks.
Distinguished guests, honored of the dais, dear parents and relatives of Shamir, and my dear friends. We are at the end of the second annual lecture organized in memory of the loss of our beloved student Shamir. In this occasion, I am here on the dais to conclude the seminar by proposing vote of thanks to all the dignitaries and participants of the seminar. At the outset, let me express our sincere gratitude to Dr. N.J. Francis, Head of the Department, who has presided over the function and delivered the presidential address. Amidst his busy schedule, Dr. M.C. Dilip Kumar, Honorable Vice Chancellor of our university, was kind enough to inaugurate the second Shamir Memorial Annual Lecture Program. I extend a heartfelt gratitude to him in his absence on behalf of the Shamir Foundation and also on behalf of the Department of History. Now, I would like to acknowledge our deep sense of gratitude to the speaker of the day, Professor Sundar Sarukkai, who delivered the second P.N. Shamir Memorial Lecture on Becoming Minority. We thank you on behalf of the Foundation, Department of History, and everyone present here for taking time of your busy schedule and engaging us with your enlightening lecture. Thank you, sir. The discussants of the lecture, Professor P.K. Poker, Dr. P. Madhu, and others, Dr. Dilip Raj, Dr. Sibyl, Dr. Ebi, Dr. Biju, and Dr. Susama, made this academic program more meaningful and lively. I take this opportunity to thank them all. Now, I must mention our deep sense of gratitude to all the participants of the program, especially his parents, relatives, teachers, friends, well-wishers, and students from different parts of Kerala and also from the university who have assembled here in the memory of our beloved Shamir. Last, but by no means least, the organizing part of the commemorative lecture is designed, planned, executed by the members of the Shamir Foundation. I thank them all my colleagues and students, and I extend a heartfelt thanks to Dr. Shiba, who is the soul and heart behind this program. Once again, I thank one and all for being together here to share the fond memories of our great student Shamir, and I hope we will cherish his memories and fulfill his dreams through our academic commitments and endeavors. Thank you.